Hello, everybody. My name is Mike Gaudette, and welcome back to another installment of Top 5 Albums, the series where I walk you through my 5 favorite albums from every year. In today's episode, we have now entered a new decade, and we're going to be talking about the year 1970. We had started this series with the year 1965, and to see how much music has changed and evolved from 65 to 70 is really amazing. It was a time of profound transformation with a lot of new styles getting developed, and as we go into the 70s, these new styles will continue to expand and break out into more and more subgenres in conjunction with the innovative technologies that were getting developed, which would open up a whole new set of musical possibilities that wouldn't have been possible years prior. So we have a really amazing decade of music ahead of us, and I'm really excited to dive into it with you and explore some of my favorite albums to come out of the 1970s. So without further ado, here are my top 5 favorite albums of 1970, starting with number 5. Okay, starting out at number 5, we have the album Third by Soft Machine. This is an amazing album by this British prog rock band. These guys were incredibly innovative for the progressive rock genre, and they were part of an emerging scene of experimental musicians, which was known as the Canterbury scene, which had formed as early as 1966. And this record would be their third album, and their first 2 albums are really solid and have a lot of interesting psychedelic and experimental stuff going on. But I think this album is really their masterpiece, where they stretched their sound out more and incorporated a lot of different elements ranging from psychedelic rock to jazz, prog rock, electronic, and avant-garde. And the album only has 4 tracks, with each being at least 18 minutes in length. And when it comes to albums that only have a few songs but they're all very long, I think an album like this is about as good as it gets. And right from the opening track, they had my complete attention. I was very intrigued by everything that was going on musically and all of the surprising twists and turns that would happen throughout the over 18-minute long song. And from that point on, this album really delivers with a lot of very tasteful tracks with a variety of different feels and styles from section to section and song to song. And it's got one song that features very nice vocals from Robert Wyatt. And the variety and unpredictability of what's going to happen next within the track listing as well as within each individual song makes for a very fun and adventurous listen. And this band has some seriously awesome musicianship as well, with some really amazing organ and piano work from Mike Ratledge, great drumming, vocals, and doubling from Robert Wyatt, great sax work from Elton Dean, and awesome bass work from Hugh Hopper. And I would say this is an album that would probably be more appealing to musicians and people who are lovers of experimental and progressive music. But for those types of listeners, I would say that this is one of the best progressive albums to come out of the early 70s, and was incredibly ahead of its time, and I think is the best album to come out of Soft Machine's discography. And the amount of influence and innovation that this band contributed to the progressive and experimental styles cannot be overstated. They are some of the earliest pioneers of progressive rock music, and I think this is hands down their best album. So that is my number 5. Now on to number 4. Alright, for number 4, I've got Ladies of the Canyon by Joni Mitchell. This is the third studio album from this legendary guitarist and songwriter's discography. And up to this point in her discography, I would say this was the strongest album that she had put out. It's got so many great classic songs of hers, and it's got a nice blend of guitar and piano-centered tracks, which makes for a nice contrast throughout the track listing. This is also the first album where she stretches out the instrumentation a little bit more, with the addition of the cello, the flute, the clarinet, and the baritone sax on 3 different songs, as well as the addition of Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young functioning as a choir singing the chorus on the final track of this album. So I really appreciate the continued expansion of her sound and instrumentation, as well as the very strong songwriting contributions that she did all throughout this record. And I really enjoy every song on this album, but if I had to narrow it down to a few, I would say that my favorites are the opener, Morning Morgantown, as well as Conversation and The Arrangement. And for side 2, my favorites would be the last 3 tracks tracks, which I think is the strongest succession of songs throughout this entire album. Big Yellow Taxi, Woodstock, and The Circle Game. The Circle Game in particular would be my favorite song from this album. I think that is one of the best closing tracks of any of her albums. It's just such a beautiful song, and then the chorus with Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young backing her up just adds so much power and beauty to an already amazing chorus, and I think it just ends the album on the most perfect and most peaceful note possible. And if you're interested in hearing a more in-depth review of Joni Mitchell's discography, I did a video ranking all of her albums from her studio discography, so if you're interested in that, feel free to check out the tier list playlist, which will be linked in the comments as well as the description. But yeah, I think this is an amazing album from her discography, and I think this is the first album that really marks a turning point in her songwriting, and you know that there is a lot of incredible stuff on the horizon based on the evolution that she has made throughout this record, and I think it sets up a really great launching pad for a lot more amazing albums to continue to be developed throughout the remainder of her discography. So that is my number 4 album. Now on to number 3. Coming in at number 3 is 12 Dreams of Dr. Sardonicus by Spirit. This is just a very solid rock album that really delivers on all fronts. It features this really nice stylistic blend of hard rock mixed with some psychedelic, prog rock, as well as folk rock, which makes for a really nice blend, which I think is a really great combination of the styles that were developed in the mid-60s as well as the newer styles that started to get incorporated more in the later part of the 60s. So I think this album really offers a little bit of everything that was great from the mid-60s to the 70s, which I really appreciate. And all of the more rocking tracks have really tasteful, grooving riffs on tracks like Animal Zoo, Mr. Skin, and When I Touch You. The more folky, acoustic-centered tracks are exceptionally beautiful, with songs like Nature's Way, Why Can't I Be Free, and Life Has Just Begun. The psychedelic elements add a really nice little additional flavor in the couple of spots that they are sprinkled in throughout the album on tracks like Love Has Found a Way. And the progressive elements do a really great job of showcasing the instrumentalists as well as the very unique sense of songwriting that this group has on tracks like Space Child. And this band is clearly very well-rounded, and they do a really great job of articulating all of these different styles in the most beautiful way. And it makes for a very fun album that I think is consistent all the way down from front to back. It doesn't have one track that I dislike. And if I had to pick a favorite song on this album, it would probably be Nature's Way. And my other favorites would be Love Has Found a Way, Space Child, and When I Touch You. So an amazing album that does a great job of encapsulating all of the different stylistic elements that were prevalent from the mid-60s to 1970. And if you haven't checked this one out, I would highly recommend it. I think most people will find this album really enjoyable and a lot of fun. So that is my number 3 album. Now on to number 2. Okay, coming in at number 2 is All Things Must Pass by George Harrison, widely regarded almost mutually by everybody as the best album of his solo discography. And this is actually his 3rd studio album, but it's the first one to be released after the breakup of the Beatles. And stylistically, his first 2 albums were much different from everything else that he would put out, and this is really his first album to put out, rock material. And it's just a creative explosion on George's part. This is a triple album with 4 sides of new originals and 2 sides titled Apple Jam, which consist of instrumental jams. And the songs from side 1 to side 4 consist of a wide variety of different tracks that were written over the years. Some were written more recently, some were written years prior, and a couple were written and offered to the Beatles but turned down. And the subject matter discussed throughout these songs is very deep. He's doing a lot of reflecting on the breakup of the Beatles, as well as tracks that are more within that spiritual realm, with a lot of songs about seeking a higher power. And that was a subject matter that was very prevalent in the earlier part of George Harrison's discography, and it spawned some really beautiful songs. And now that he has had this chance to have his creative explosion, I think it resulted in probably the best triple album of all time. time. There are so many gems all throughout this album. Side 1 in particular is probably my favorite side of the entire album. I think it's got the strongest succession of songs and also contains the largest amount of my favorite songs from this record. And of the remaining sides, 2, 3, and 4, my favorite tracks from those would be What Is Life, Run of the Mill, Ballad of Sir Frankie Crisp, the title track All Things Must Pass, as well as Art of Dying. Just an incredible album filled with so many masterpieces. And if we're talking George Harrison's solo discography altogether, this album would also contain the largest amount of my favorite songs from all of his solo albums as well. And for his first post-Beatles solo record, I do not think he could have put out a better album. I think he knocked it out of the park and really demonstrated how strong of a songwriter he was on his own and how it was probably the right move at this point to go his separate ways with the Beatles. And if you're interested in hearing a more in-depth review of George Harrison's discography, I did a video ranking all of his studio albums, and that can be found in the tier list playlist in the comments as well as in the description. So that is my number 2. Now for the grand reveal, here is my number 1 favorite album of 1970. All right, coming in at number 1 is After the Gold Rush by Neil Young, an absolutely incredible album that I do not have one bad thing to say about. It's one of those rare albums that I would say is perfect from front to back, not one wasted moment. Every single song on here is amazing. The choice in mood from track to track makes for a very dynamic and enjoyable listen that takes you through a lot of different feels. And if we're talking favorite Neil Young songs, I would say that this album also contains the largest amount of my favorite tracks by him as well. Side 1 is 5 tracks long and has a beautiful selection of songs with a really great variety in instrumentation from track to track, opening up with 2 more stripped down songs, starting with Tell Me Why, which is just acoustic guitar and vocals, and then the follow-up track, which is the title track, After the Gold Rush, is just piano, vocals, and flugelhorn. Tell Me Why is definitely one of the high points of side 1 for me. In my opinion, it is the most beautiful and perfect opening track that he could have picked for this album. It's got a beautiful chord progression, great vocal melodies, and really pretty vocal harmonies, particularly in the chorus, and just one of those songs that tugs at your heartstrings and would definitely be a favorite of mine from this album. And I really love every other track from side 1, but if I had to narrow it down to one other favorite, it would definitely be Only Love Can Break Your Heart. I consider that to be a perfect song, and that one, as well as Tell Me Why, would probably be my 2 favorite songs from this record. And the other 3 tracks are all incredible as well, and like I said, they all work off of one another very nicely. Side 2 then delivers another 6 amazing tracks with a really great variety in energy from song to song. It's got a great mix of ballads with a couple of more energetic and driving tracks, which makes for a very balanced and enjoyable listen. 5 of the tracks are originals, and the opener is a cover of a Don Gibson song titled Oh Lonesome Me, which opens up side 2 on a really nice mellow and somber sort of mood. I really love the addition of the harmonica on that track. I think it adds a really nice touch. And the remainder of side 2 has mostly full band songs, as well as one other stripped down piano and vocal centered track titled Birds, which is another one that has absolutely beautiful vocal harmonies going on, and they work really nicely against the piano. And again, I love every single song on side 2, and it's pretty hard for me to narrow this side down to a couple of favorites, but if I had to pick a few, I would say my favorites are When You Dance, I Can Really Love, and I would say it's a tie between Birds and I Believe in You for my favorite ballad. But as you can see, I do not have a bad thing to say about this record. I think it's one of those rare records where it is perfect from front to back with no dull or skip over tracks, and each track has a very important function when it comes to the flow and the mood of the album. And I think it has Neil Young's most beautiful ballads of his entire discography with tracks like Tell Me Why, Only Love Can Break Your Heart, Birds, and I Believe in You. And it also has some of the best rocking tracks of Neil Young's discography as well, with tracks like Southern Man, Don't Let It Bring You Down, and When You Dance I can really love. And I'm sure most people watching this video are well aware of this album. This one is by no means a deep cut or an obscure choice. But for anybody who hasn't heard it, I would highly recommend checking this one out. It's got some really beautiful stuff. I do not think you will be disappointed with this one. So that is my number 1 favorite album of 1970. So to recap, at number 5, we had Third by Soft Machine. Number 4 was Ladies of the Canyon by Joni Mitchell. Number 3 was 12 Dreams of Dr. Sardonicus by Spirit. Number 2 was All Things Must Pass by George Harrison. And number 1 was After the Gold Rush by Neil Young. If you haven't heard any of these albums before and you end up checking them out, please let me know what you think in the comments. And also, please feel free to let me know what your top 5 favorite albums of 1970 are. I would love to hear your thoughts. Alright, that is it for today. Thanks so much for watching, and stay tuned for my top 5 favorite albums of 1971. I'll see you then. Take care.